listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacco Zwetsloot, and today it is the morning of Tuesday, the 6th of September, 2022 in Seoul, and I'm joined here via Zoom by Soo Kim, somewhere in Washington, D.C., and it's still last night, so we're going backwards in time. Before we get started, I'd like to remind all of you listeners, please to leave a review about this podcast wherever you can. Spotify allows ratings, but not reviews. Audible allows reviews. Apple allows both. And on YouTube, you can like and subscribe and maybe even make a comment. Second, check out nknews.org and consider buying a subscription that helps to fund the excellent journalism that my colleagues put out every day. Thirdly, follow me on Twitter at Jacco Z and NK News at nknews.org, all one word. For podcast suggestions, feedback, questions, you can tweet at us or email us at podcast@nknews.org. Okay, to introduce my guest today properly, Soo Kim is a policy analyst at RAND Corporation, focused on national security and policy issues in the Indo-Pacific, the intelligence community, and U.S. Homeland Security. Before that, she spent 7 years at the Central Intelligence Agency as a career analyst. She has done stints at the Department of State and several CIA-led interagency task forces handling the DPRK nuclear and leadership crises. Kim received a doctorate in international affairs from the Johns Hopkins University SAIS, and you can find her on Twitter at MLLSOOKIM. Welcome on the show, Soo Kim.
Thanks for having me.
So I thought we'd talk a little bit about intelligence, propaganda, and North Korea's decision-making processes today. Given your CIA background, I have to ask first off, have you ever been part of a black ops?
So I like to tell people that my job was no different from any other desk job you could have. There's, the cooler talk. There are occasional potlucks that people would do.
Potlucks, wow.
So, potlucks, yes. Black ops, if I was part of it, I would not know about it.
Right, and even if you had, could you tell us?
I think we know the answer to that.
Right, yes. You'd have to kill me. Now, when one is an analyst for the CIA or any intelligence organization, one obviously has access to information that is not open source. That is information gathered through, for example, signals intelligence, geospatial or imagery intelligence, human intelligence, measurement and signature intelligence, and other sources. But when you leave the CIA, assuming that you don't have a constant regular leak from someone still within the agency, you're suddenly cut off from those sources. And I guess what I'm really wondering is, how does a former intelligence agent transfer those skills learned at the agency into an environment where they no longer have access to sources and materials they once had at their fingertips?
Well, I think you honed in on something that is, obviously having the sources and the tradecraft is very important, but I think equally important is having the knowledge and the background. And for me, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of other Korea watchers as well, having the Korean language, being familiar with the culture, and just keeping up to speed with what's going on in both the Koreas was tremendously helpful. I think that being out of the IC, it affords a lot of freedom that you don't necessarily have when you're subject to obviously the regulations and the accountability that you have as an intelligence officer. So I think from my perspective and from my experience, I felt like this liberation, so to speak, was much more enriching for me professionally and also personally as well, as I think that I grew much more since my departure from the agency, as I was able to contribute to various platforms, written, online, television, media, and so forth, and interacting with people who have held stints, not just in the IC, but in DOD, State Department, academia, Korean government, and so forth. It allows, I think, a collection and treatment of resources that in a classified setting, you might not be able to have the time or the luxury to look at.
I should point out to our listeners that you used a little bit of jargon there. IC is, of course, intelligence community. That's something that I didn't know before I started doing this podcast, but I had to pick up pretty quickly. So That's a clear sign that you were once a member of the IC, because only former IC people say IC. Now, how does a former agent, or how does a former member of the IC stay on top of things and relevant to the conversation? In other words, you can't access the classified information. So what do you go to for things? Is it just media?
Sure. I think it depends on, well, I mean, it's also personality dependent, I would say, and depending on how you've been trained academically, personally, professionally. I'm sure there are go-to sources and your way of vetting the accuracy and the authoritativeness of the information that you're consuming. So uh, when I stepped out from the IC, I was not actually worried about the lack of information on North Korea in the open world, because as you know, I think in recent years we've seen much more information on North Korea, lives of escapees being, accounted in YouTube channels. There's much more of a reception, I think, and also I think of just diverse platforms where you can share information. So the challenge now, I think, is less about whether or not the sources are classified, but how do you make sense of all of the information that's coming out? I think that's probably the bigger challenge, because it's, when quantity expands or when quantity increases, that means, of course, you have much more volume to deal with. Then you have to face the challenge of time and prioritization, as well as, which sources are actually legitimate for an analyst and for people who are really serious about the business.
As an American citizen, it's obviously not really possible for you to make regular visits to North Korea to get a feel of things on the ground. But do you see a value in, and do you yourself make regular visits to South Korea to get a feel of how things are here?
So I have not made a personally visit to South Korea since pre-pandemic. I do think that, the opportunity to interact with Korean scholars, Korean North Korea watchers, in Korea-based think tanks, NGOs, is valuable. But I think during the pandemic, I think we've also learned the agility of having these virtual platforms where you can, without having to feel like you're imposing on the other person. There's much more of, I think, an openness for people to communicate online. So I think that takes care of the efficiency aspect. But I do think that making visits and frequently communicating with counterparts in South Korea and perhaps even in other countries, I know that there are some UK-based scholars as well, is tremendously helpful, because from just when you're an analyst, you spend a lot of time thinking and examining an issue by yourself. And I think we tend to fall into our biases and assumptions, and we expect things to happen. And sometimes two people can read the same document and get shades of differences in their interpretation. And I think this is where interaction and feedback are really helpful.
Yes, yeah. No, I take your point that during the pandemic there was a lot more opportunities to communicate via screen and other non-in-person methods. But I think we can't overstate the value of actually getting a sense of things on the ground. I'm not going to name any names, but I can think of some scholars online who have written quite a bit about the Koreas and who have the language and the culture, you'd think, but they haven't been in South Korea for many years. And so it seems that during the latter years of the Moon administration, if I were to take their analysis on face value, that we were one step off of communism here in South Korea, and President Moon was a crypto-communist who was about to hand over the keys to the kingdom to Kim Jong Un. And that wasn't a sense that you could get from being on the ground here, but it was if you were staying in America and looking only at extreme right-wing Korean YouTube channels and media. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that to sort of restate the value of coming here and getting a sense. And it's a pity that none of us at the moment, of course, ever since the pandemic, no one's been able to do that in North Korea. No one's been able to walk around and see what's going on there. That's very much a closed system to us. So all we have is documentation and videos and accounts of people who come out, which have their own limitations and biases too, right? Because they're especially for people who come out, that whatever time they came out, that's the most recent thing they've got. They don't really have access to what's happening on the ground since they've left, most of them.
Right. And I guess this is where, again, it's different. Having access to South Korea is very different from having access to North Korea. And I think for people with perhaps previous government experience too, I, for one, I cannot picture myself going to North Korea at any point to do research. For my personal safety reasons and for my, based on my previous affiliation, also my current affiliation. So the rare opportunities that people actually have to go inside North Korea, of course, they're going to be bringing back firsthand knowledge about the country. But I think we also have to remember that whatever we see and observe in North Korea, we do also have to remember that this is a very packaged country where if you're traveling in Pyongyang, you're not going to see the realities of an average ordinary North Korean citizen struggling to get by. You're going to see what the regime wants the external observers to see. So, and again, this is where the value of having the knowledge, the geographical knowledge, the cultural familiarity, the language is supposed to help. But I think also in some cases, you run across the gamut of Korea watchers and specialists. Everyone has their particular views about politics, economics, military, and so forth. So I could sit with a fellow Korea researcher and we could see eye to eye on one issue, but we could be totally, on different planes on a different issue because of our biases, and I think also the background, our training, whether we've been trained as an academic or a military person or a diplomat, that is going to color the lens, I think, from which we do look at the country and we do make the assessments.
How does that inform, or how does that affect decision making by governments? I mean, it's very true, as you say, that two people can agree on one thing, but then look at the same document and see them in completely different ways. And then ultimately, it's the job of the intelligence community to try to give assessments and forecasts to governments to make decisions on things. And well, we've seen that in the last 2 decades some cases where that's gone disastrously wrong. So are there checks and balances or ways to try to mitigate the biases and the differences of understanding of the same documents?
Well, I think this is where the interagency process or the interagency community would come in. As intel officers, we're clearly not supposed to prescribe policy, and our job is to, I'm sure you've heard this before, but we are supposed to be analyzing the data that we have in our hands and to present a fact-based assessment for decision makers. So we're not really there to color to offer our shades of interpretation, but there is an issue at hand. You are given, a number of sources, as you mentioned earlier, HUMINT, SIGINT, MASINT, and so forth. And your job is to present what I think is supposed to be a picture that is as accurate to the realities of geopolitics, of the circumstances of the country as you can, based on, in the case of North Korea, based on what limited information that you have. And as I mentioned, people from the DoD, from State Department, from the CIA, from NSA, we're all coming together basically at the table. And I think not to sound cliche-ish, but I think the beauty of having this community is so that everyone comes together and shares their assessment on the same topic. And that's where I think assessing the veracity and the authenticity and authoritativeness of the sources and trying to figure out, in this particular situation, does HUMINT prevail over SIGINT, or
Hmm.
should we be considering SIGINT factors more seriously as opposed to what we've heard from people who are on the ground? So it also depends on the issue. And I think this is where analysis is not really, there is a science to it, but it's also knowing, the shades of different meanings, and also understanding that it's also about interpretation. But of course, you have to you have to kind of balance the line between what's fact versus what you're trying to impose as your opinions and I guess in some cases you may want to try to push your own agenda,
Mm.
and that is not your job, obviously.
Is there a major difference in the way that the IC understands North Korea compared to other countries? I'm thinking specifically because it's really North Korea is inaccessible to intelligence officers. You can't send a CIA agent to go and do some on-the-ground observations in the way that you can in almost every other country in the world. So does that lead to significant differences in just methods and ways of understanding?
I haven't really analyzed another country as an intelligence officer, so I can't really say if North Korea is going to be different. But I would say that having worked in a classified setting and now working in an open environment, to me, I still think that no matter how sparse the information set, you can still draw conclusions. You can still identify gaps that are still tremendously helpful. I mean, you can have all of the information that you need or that you could possibly have, and you can still draw an inaccurate conclusion. So ideally, of course, yes, it's going to be much more, I think it would make the life of a North Korean analyst much easier if we can verify the information. But in this case, we cannot.
Yeah.
But I think there's enough analysis, enough history, enough previous research done by senior scholars and former government officials that even if we can't connect the dots to draw a complete finished picture, we can still sort of make out, I would say, the hazy contours of what that figure is supposed to be.
Well, in understanding those hazy contours, given the limitations, what does the intelligence community do well on North Korea? And feel free to be as granular in the detail as you can about what areas of North Korea it really has a good grip on.
Well, it's been almost a decade since I left. So I imagine the offices have changed. I also imagine the personnel has changed. One thing that I can say that the Intel community does really well is that, well, of course, there's a recognition that the problem is it's a persistent threat. I do think that when it comes to understanding the Kim regimes, and that this could be Kim Jong-il regime or Kim Jong-un regime, understanding the strategy of the country, especially vis-a-vis their weapons program, I think that the Intel community and perhaps just the broader interagency does a fairly consistent job, I would say, in terms of understanding the seriousness of the threat, while also trying to, and this is going to depend, I think, on politics as well, but understanding that it's not just about the use of force, but also efforts to communicate to the North Koreans that the United States and perhaps even South Korea is open to diplomacy. And that's, of course, what the Biden administration has been stressing, is that the door remains open to diplomacy, but it's also on the regime to try to open this door and to try to resume dialogue with Washington in the hopes of reducing the DPRK nuclear threat. But as we know, we don't really see any indications of that right now.
You say that you've been out of the IC for about a decade. Were you there in the early part of the Kim Jong-un years of North Korea?
I was, but I don't think we had a clear understanding of Kim Jong-un as a person. I would say that the entire world, I would say, didn't really have a clear grasp of him. I don't think we do still. I think we're still trying to assess who he is and his weaknesses. We know that he's been having some health problems. We are basically piecing the dots together based on our knowledge of the Kim family. and how his grandfather and his father had ruled the country. And I do think that we are doing consistent effort, I would say, in terms of trying to check our assumptions with what's actually going on inside North Korea. And also, I think for me, I think it's important to, obviously, we want to get a better grasp of what's going on in North Korea. But sometimes I think that with politics and the change in administration and different prioritizations by new presidents in the United States and South Korea and so forth, we might see the problem still consistently the same way. But I think the approaches that we take are quite different sometimes. I think the bottom line doesn't change, but because the approach changes, I think sometimes we kind of fool ourselves into thinking that maybe we're dealing with something different here. But I could be wrong, but I don't think we're dealing with a North Korea that's really changed since Kim Jong Un.
Can you think of any mistakes or failings made by the intelligence community in the last decade while Kim Jong Un has been in power?
Well, the biggest mistake, and I think I could try to advocate on behalf of the IC, or I think on behalf of all Korea watchers, is that we assumed, or we expected, Kim Jong Un to falter as a leader because of the lack of leadership experience. He's young, he was exposed to European education, he was into basketball. So all of these activities that he participated in, we thought in any normal adolescent would see influence. And we expected, on the one hand, we expected him to be much more open to the Western world. And in some ways he is, but not to the extent that he's going to want to consider economically and politically reforming his country, because that is going to be equivalent to, of course, consequences on his leadership and the Kim regime. So I think I'm not sure if we got it wrong, but I think that we came to make quick conclusions about Kim Jong Un and what he's able to do. But, he's been in power for, about a decade. And of course, he has also made, I would say, small mistakes, but it doesn't really change the calculus for him. I think he is still making progress as a leader. He has been able to make tremendous leaps and bounds in his weapons development programs, of course. And of course, we don't know what is going on inside North Korea's decision making and how to really characterize Kim Jong Un's grip on power. But I think on the exterior, we see a leader who is still able to maintain his mandate. We do see, I think, some moments of insecurity where he does try to tighten and increase surveillance on the people in the form of course, restricting access to external information. But by and large, he doesn't seem, we're seeing the same North Korea that we saw during Kim Jong-il's era, I would say, broadly speaking, with their interactions with the United States and South Korea, the external world. But again, I think that if we were dealing with an open country, say that we were dealing with a South Korean government and we had no idea who this new leader was, except for, tricklings of information, would we be so critical, I think, about that, about our miscalculations and, our misjudgment on the future, the longevity of a person's leadership and the future of a country. And I think that's where, not to cut Korean watchers, of course, slack, but I think in dealing with North Korea, nobody, I think, can say with confidence that they can predict what's going to happen with Kim Jong Un or his family or the country's decision making. It's just we're throwing, I think, a shot in the dark, and at best, we're trying to make informed decisions. But to say that whether it's the IC or the U.S. government or South Koreans, to say that we got it wrong, I think it makes, I think, the North Korea challenge, and I think the job of analysts, much more like a it becomes more like a mathematical formula where there's a clear right and wrong answer.
Hmm.
And in this case, I think you have to leave room for some grays.
Okay, I want to come back later on to North Korea's decision making, but first let's talk about propaganda for a little bit, because that's one of your research areas is North Korean propaganda, and of course it through the decades, North Korean prop has come in various forms since the late 1940s. North Korea's had its own newspapers, and then there were leaflets during the Korean War, and now we have YouTube videos, and each one is crafted with a different message and trying to reach a different target audience with a specific desired effect. Could you give us a brief overview of how you look at North Korean propaganda?
So I think we've been seeing a lot of YouTube channels from North Korean escapees. And I think on the one hand, it's great. I think that having people speak out against the regime, trying to, it is about telling the truth, but I think that every escapee has their personal narrative and their experiences and how they got to where they are today. So there's no set way, I think, that an escapee is motivated to leave the country and go through the trials and the suffering, essentially, to leave their country and to create a new life. So I think in that respect, it's been very, in some ways, it's been overwhelming because we're seeing a lot of these channels pop up. So depending on, I think, your specialty area, you could spend a lot of time looking at these videos and trying to understand perhaps a new facet of North Korean life inside the country, the experiences of then North Koreans of varying backgrounds too. We have, people who were more from the more ordinary classes. We have, North Korean escapees who were from the more established and well-to-do families also. So the backgrounds, I think, are very, very interesting.
But I'm thinking specifically about the YouTube videos made by and released by North Korea.
The regime. Yeah. So that is also very interesting. So I think that this is a fine line for me. I know that there is some value in having information come out basically directly from the regime to the internal or international observers. But this is where I think your judgment as an analyst, your judgment as a Korea watcher is actually very, very important. Is that one, you need to determine what is fact and what is not, what is not really fact, but what's distorted by the regime. But even with that, I think you could still analyze the style of the messaging and why the regime chooses to use this vehicle versus something else to convey maybe a point of criticism, about their COVID policy or their restrictions on the young people and how much freedom people actually have inside the country. So I'm neither for nor against, I think, what comes out from the state propaganda. But I do think that if the information does come out, we do need to be more vigilant, and not just in analyzing the content, but also kind of putting checks and balances on our own thought process as well.
Now, do you draw a clear distinction between North Korea's internal messaging and North Korea's external messaging? Because it seems to me, just, given the stability of the regime for the last 70 years, that North Korea's internal propaganda has worked pretty well. But North Korea's external propaganda, either towards South Korea or to the rest of the world, has pretty much failed or even backfired. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, back in the 1980s and 1990s, North Korea state paid lots of money to have full-page advertisements in the New York Times, for example, without really any effect. And then just, 7 years ago, when Park Geun-hye was president, they were sending leaflets over here with very graphic and visually offensive cartoons and content, and I don't think that turned many South Korean people into North Korean fans. So how do you see the difference between internal and external propaganda?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think this is where North Korea has a really good understanding, I would say, of how the external world perceives the country, and when it comes to strategizing on obviously the priority topics, weapons, leadership. I don't think that they've been really off the mark in many cases. But I think when it comes to state propaganda or their messaging towards the external audience, it seems like there are sensitivities and areas that we, for North Korea, should be off limits, criticizing the leadership and pointing out weaknesses in the system. And that's where we see, a sensitive reaction from North Korea. But as you said, these messages aren't really catching the rest of us. And it could be, of course, the style of delivery. But I think the kernel of truth is where we're at odds, is because we know as external observers and we know as historians, as policy specialists, how the Korean War evolved and how it concluded, the inter-Korean relations between, across various presidencies, U.S. North Korean negotiations. The facts are pretty much available for people to examine and to debate and to analyze and offer their own interpretations. But North Korea's efforts to basically not address these truths and to just continue to push a certain type of narrative that might work with the North Korean internal population, but it's not going to work for the rest of us because we have it's not a privilege, but we have the basic rights, I think, to be able to make that judgment ourselves without being forced and fed the information. So the freedom of choice, and I think the freedom to be able to question, the freedom of education, well, not education, but the freedom to make our own decisions and assess things for ourselves, I think is big. So I think from North Korea's perspective, they have a clear understanding that it's very different systems, but you're still seeing things from a very North Korean and Kim Jong Un regime or Kim regime lens. And therefore, the messages that you are crafting are going to have that flavor and that twist. And this is where we do see that gap between the efforts and the effectiveness of some of their messaging, I would say.
What tools can we bring to analyze North Korean propaganda, and why is it worth bothering? What can we actually learn about North Korea from it?
So I will just say that I actually love North Korean propaganda.
You and me both, Sue. We got that in common. I'm a big fan of the comic books and the leaflets, especially.
I began my career studying North Korean propaganda, and I think I am grateful for that opportunity because it allows you to really understand, if I can dare say this, but you can try to understand how North Korea thinks. I'm not really talking about the people, but the system, and I think that laid a really good foundation for understanding and trying to piece together the different parts of the North Korea puzzle. To your question about what tools and what do we actually need to be able to better understand propaganda, but also North Korea. I don't think this is it's not a tangible tool, and I think the most important thing is you have to be really self-aware, and I think that comes down to having a little more humility in what we know and what we don't know, because I think a lot of senior Korea watchers say this, but they say that the more you study this country, the more you realize there's just so many more things that you don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that should remind ourselves that, we could be prolific authors, we could be, making important decisions. But at the end of the day, we're still dealing with many unknowns. And I think in a rapidly changing environment, not just in the Korean Peninsula, but amid the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, COVID-19 is still sort of bothering us, US-China competition. There's so many things that are distracting, I think, our ability to really clearly see the problem. And that's where I think we do sometimes need to take a step back and maybe even look at the way we're approaching the problem. I also fall into that step or that trap where I'm used to the way that I look at North Korea. So it would be beneficial for me also to check my own expectations and my own my own version of how we're seeing things at play between the two Koreas in South Korea and also in North Korea as well. So obviously, if you have the language, if you have the academic training, the professional training, the trade craft, those are also basic skills. But I think with all of that, if you keep thinking that whatever quote unquote prediction you made about the country is right, and you have these "I told you so" moments, I don't know if that's going to be helpful for really understanding the country and yeah, just for our, I think, professional and personal growth. If we're in this business for our own curiosities and we really care about the problem, I do think that is probably the best prescription that I could think of for myself is to be more self-aware and to be aware of my own shortcomings and to find also ways to look at the problem not in the typical way that you would because of your training as an analyst or as a diplomat, but as I mentioned earlier, how a DoD person looks at North Korea might be different from how a State Department person looks at it. So also trying to, I mean, you're never going to see it perfectly from their perspective, but also trying to see why they're drawing a conclusion from that person's, optics. I think that's also helpful too.
Let's move on to North Korea's decision-making processes. What can we understand about how the North Korea's leadership makes decision on specifically national security and domestic economy issues?
It all comes down to the regime, I think. I mean, national security is so tied to, Kim Jong Un's own survival. And I think even economic decision making. I think one instance of Kim Jong Un overlooking an economic situation and sort of letting go of his reins could spell implications for his standing as a leader. That as much as we want to see Kim Jong Un consider slightly pivoting from his position to consider, economic modernization, that in turn, I think, is also going to. So if Kim were to consider reform or some sort of moderation, either politically or economically, it's going to have basically a domino effect on the other. So I see the two as intertwined, and both of them clearly feed into, again, this big question mark for Kim, which is, what's going to be my fate? So that's how I see it, and I think based on what we've also seen in terms of statements coming out from North Korea and the most recent efforts to negotiate with Kim Jong Un, it kind of tells us that he's not really looking to give up the weapons because no matter how much the United States and our partners will guarantee and assure Kim Jong Un, survival or security, it's probably not going to be sufficient for him to place that sufficient trust and to say that he's going to make that big leap.
But to what extent is he in control? Do you see, is Kim Jong-un above the system? Is he the system? Is it a case like in the French l'état c'est moi, or is he locked within the system, or is he simply a part of the system?
If a leader were truly above the system, would we actually see so much, so many constraints and so much repression? There's something that's driving Kim, and I would say the regime at large, something that's driving Kim to be the way he is. And I would say that if he felt comfortable that the system is really in his control, we might see a different behavior. I do wonder if Kim feels more constrained by the system, and there's constant pressure for Kim to to show ruthlessness and to show and to basically demand and have people have no choice but to submit, because somebody who is and this is drawing kind of extrapolating Kim Jong-un to just an ordinary person, but somebody who's really confident and self-assured would not have to go through such lengths to prove anything. He's got nothing to prove, and he wouldn't have to worry about control as much. But because control is so inherent to his survival, I think that for as long as Kim Jong-un lives, and for as long as he is the North Korean leader and he has the same motivations, we're going to see this vicious cycle where he tries to sort of incentivize, aka try to intimidate the North Korean population into submission, and that is going to somehow it's going to assure Kim Jong Un that he's doing okay, and that his survival for X number of years is going to be guaranteed.
During the last 2.5 years of the pandemic, decisions were made at a high level in North Korea that it was more important to keep COVID out and prevent vectors of infection from coming in than it was to ensure that normal diplomacy could go ahead with diplomats coming and going to Pyongyang, and more important than the continued work of international aid organizations in the North. Now, some have suggested that this was because security agencies and ministries are now much more powerful than, for example, the foreign ministry. How do you see this, and how do you think that decision was made to go into a complete nationwide lockdown?
My answer to that is Kim Jong Un. For me, I know that it's important as a Korea watcher, as a North Korea watcher, to understand and to keep abreast of who is ranked where in their hierarchy of power. It indicates, one, of course, either their proximity or their relationship to Kim Jong-un, how much trust he puts on them. And also, I think in return, there might be even greater pressure on them to perform well. It also indicates particular policies or issues that might be of greater sensitivity for Kim Jong-un. So in that respect, I think it's helpful. But bottom line, it's still Kim Jong-un who is the leader. It's still Kim Jong-un who is going to make that decision about the broader, more the important decisions that are being made for the country. So I recognize the value in the analysis, but I also think that we do have to just keep that perspective that it's not a cadre of military officials that are making decisions. As far as we know, still seems to be Kim Jong-un. As far as the lockdown goes, I mean, how else would North Korea have handled it if they do not have the sufficient medical health, supplies, the technology, the manpower, the knowledge, the skills, and all that stuff? If they don't have that, how else would they have been able to contain or try to grapple with the pandemic that, I mean, frankly, we didn't know what was going to happen either. So the fact that the regime decided to lock down the country so quickly after we found out about COVID, it seems to be, to me, a very logical next step for the regime. But I think the catch is that you have the lockdown and you're keeping and you're monitoring the travel, the influx and the outflux of people and goods. It's great, but you also need to have the adequate economic, the adequate public health measures in place to sort of manage this. It was a global crisis and it's still an ongoing thing. So I think that's where that extra step that Kim needed to have taken didn't happen. And as far as we know that North Korea does have COVID cases, but still is not accepting, vaccinations and efforts from us, from the international community, to address this and to try to. I mean, we can't stop COVID, of course, but try our best to manage it, especially in a country like North Korea.
What do you believe, going back in time a bit, what do you believe led Kim Jong-un to decide in the beginning of 2018 to seek talks with South Korea and the US rather than continued confrontation? And it's a question that there's still a lot of disagreement about whether he sought talks because he was afraid of what Donald Trump might do, or because he felt that he was in a strong position and now was the time to bargain. How do you see that?
Well, I think that if Kim Jong Un, no matter how bold he sounds, and the nuclear weapons aside, Kim does live with, I would say, the fear of consequences, not just to his regime. I think the regime is one thing, but I think to his own personal safety or survival. So I think that that's something that is always going to be in the back of his mind. It's always going to be something that is quite harrowing for him. As much as we see this leader who is he scary? Yes, he is, but but I think there probably were multiple factors that played in. We did see an escalation of tensions between North Korea and the United States, but we also had a very cooperative South Korea at the time that was trying to make things, try to smooth out the bumps between the two countries. And why, like, what is there for Kim Jong Un to lose? Like, what's there for him to lose by seeking negotiations and dialogue with the U.S. president? We clearly saw that there were many PR opportunities. There were also some anticipation and optimism that perhaps this time around we might see something different happen with North Korea. But I would say also that from the onset, and we can go as far back as the Pyeongchang Olympics or the Korean Summit that spring, but there was no commitment, written or verbal, from North Korea to denuclearization of North Korea. It was denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and that, I think, should have kind of made us kind of click and say, maybe this is not really going to be anything new. But perhaps because, again, new leadership, which I think kind of breeds optimism, and if you're kind of fatigued with the cycle of negotiations, then perhaps there were people who actually believed that we might be able to see some irreversible changes on the peace front. And unfortunately, that did not seem to have happened since 2018 to 2020.
Does the US understanding of Kim Jong-un's decision-making process significantly affect its own decision-making process in how it acts and reacts to North Korea?
I think that depends on the leadership too, and the administration, of course, and the people who are advising the president. I think might have a rich background on the Korean Peninsula. They might have a good understanding, or they might not. But again, I don't think this problem is just exclusive to the United States. I think we could also say the same thing about the South Korean presidencies in the past and the current, that our own understanding and maybe our own even expectations about certain policy goals that we want to achieve, whether it's North Korea or something that's tangentially related to the Korean Peninsula, will, I think, inevitably color our views and the way that we proceed with the North Korea challenge. And especially because this is not a new problem. This is something that we have been dealing with for many decades, that there might be fatigue. And, maybe instead of trying to go for, go big or go nothing, or go big or go home.
Go big or go home, yeah.
Right. Trying a piecemeal approach that sort of leads us to that ultimate goal might seem to be more enticing than trying to do something that sounds so massive, and you can't do it with an administration. And I think that's also just part of human nature, I think. Yeah.
If things continue as they are without any major changes, where do you think we will be on the Korean Peninsula 10 years from now?
This kind of sounds like a question, where do you see yourself 10 years from now?
Yeah, it does a bit. Yes.
Whereas it's more like, where do you see North Korea 10 years from now? 10 years from now, Kim Jong-un is probably going to be in his, late 40s. Yeah.
Yeah.
assuming that his health is okay. Um, he might still be in power. You know, this is where we have to be focused and also sober about the North Korea problem. Realistically, we have to be really realistic about it. But I think in the case of today's geopolitical stakes and uncertainties, we're also seeing this. It's not, I wouldn't call it a trend, but we're seeing steps, movements that sort of indicate that while we recognize that North Korea is a growing, persistent, and a very reliable problem, there are other broader, bigger picture issues that are or that seem to be of greater strategic importance to the major countries. And of course, we're talking about the United States and China. While we cannot dismiss and overlook these problems, I think the trying to kind of bucket the North Korea problem under these broader issues and sort of treating it as a sub issue, I think is only going to play into Kim Jong Un's anticipation, perhaps. It's not like he's planning this, but that's how I see it. So, I mean, I do think that Washington and Seoul they're recognizing that this is a problem, but from the U.S.'s perspective, there are bigger fish to fry. That's a cliche, but that's how it sees it. So I wonder if we're going to prolong dealing with the North Korea problem to a point where it cannot be contained or addressed in the right word, not efficient, but dealt in the most reasonable, let's say reasonable manner, because to sort of ignore North Korea and to dismiss and to treat these weapons provocations as an ordinary everyday thing. On the one hand, I think it tells Kim Jong Un that we are not going to be responding to every little provocation of yours, but it also might be telling Kim that it's okay. And our tolerance and our threshold for pain is actually getting higher. And therefore, maybe 10 years down the road, we might be seeing a bigger North Korea problem. And in that case, how is that going to alter the alliance, but also the way the power dynamics are sort of trying to be balanced out right now? How is that going to look, a decade later?
Last question. This one's completely out of left field. Should South Korea get its own nuclear weapons? And if so, why?
I don't think I have the professional or the intellectual capacity or the background or the authority to really say this, but I know that it's been coming up more frequently now, I think.
Right. This is why I'm asking this question a lot these days, because it just seems that in the last year, out of nowhere, I'm suddenly hearing this from a lot of places, both in South Korea and in the United States, and it surprised me.
Well, I think it's not just the sophistication of North Korea's weapons, but we are also seeing a live example before our eyes with Russia and Ukraine. So the threat of instability, the questions of what if, and greater insecurity that stems not just from the ongoing war, but also, I would say also that the pandemic has also kind of altered our perceptions about alliance relations, reliability, and the ability to self-defense, and how do you manage your own national interests versus assisting and prioritizing relationships with an ally. So those are, I think, legitimate questions, but I think again, the consequences of more countries going nuclear. Of course, that's not really within my lane to talk about it, but I do think that it's very easy for politicians, I think, to talk about this because it's sensational. It also brings in nationalism, and it could sort of exacerbate perhaps lingering resentment or even intensify certain attitudes you have towards a country. But again, we do need to think about the realities of that happening. And I think at that point, it's not just going to be South Korea, but what about Japan
Yep.
and other countries in the region? So
Yes.
I think from the arguments that are being made, either for or against, to me, seem valid from their perspective. But I think if you're talking about the interests of one, of course, national security and national interests, but also how might this play into dynamics broadly, where I think we are looking probably at a very different and stark picture.
A very restrained answer, very diplomatic. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you once again, Soo Kim, for coming on the NK News podcast.
Thanks.
Listeners, don't forget that you can find Soo Kim on Twitter at MLLSOOKIM. We'll put a link in the show notes. And ladies and gentlemen, if you already have an NK News subscription, do take a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services specifically catered to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. It's almost like being a member of the IC without having to join the agency. You can inquire about access and a free trial membership by writing an email to membership@nknews.org today. Also, if you have any feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, please send them to podcast@nknews.org. Our thanks, as always, go to Brian Betts and Arius Dare for facilitating this episode, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius. Thanks, and listen again next time.